Well, he was a lowlife. His name was Tony Quave, and I didn't write it into the script because I had a flash of trying to be politically correct, and probably I made a mistake. And maybe if I could talk to somebody that had a speech impediment, they would tell me, yes, it's okay to do it because it was an actual thing. You're not making fun of the guy. But his name was Tony, and when Tony would talk, he talked like that. And nobody liked Tony, not because he talked like that, but because Tony was a rotten son of a bitch and he needed killing. And what Tony would do, he was a vice cop. He was plain clothes, he was undercover, but every hooker in Atlanta knew who he was. So what he would do, he would catch a hooker in a parking lot with nobody around. He would walk up to her, he would put the badge on her, and he would feel her up and steal her money. But he wouldn't bust her. So what he was doing was shaking down the girls. And then later, he busted Shannon, who was the dwarf, but it was a setup because he entrapped her. And I lost the case because the guy lied in my face. I was cross-examining, and he lied to me, and I had nowhere to go. The judge told me to move on. I had nowhere to go. I blew the case. I went back and I talked to Sly about it, and I said, I told him what happened, and he said, you should have been better prepared, but he said, there's a way around it. I said, well, how do I handle this? What do I do? And he said, you got two options. One, you can walk away, or two, you're going to create a mortal enemy. And I said, Sly, I'm not walking away. So he said, okay, lesson number one, fight fire with fire. So weeks and weeks later, Sly brought in a woman who was an undercover cop in another city, and she was what we call a light hooker. Sometimes on weekends she would work as a hooker, but in reality she was a vice cop. I always thought that was an interesting match. But Sly brought her in to pretend to be a hooker here in Atlanta. Well, Tony picked her up, and they battered back and forth for a minute, and then Tony busted her for solicitation, but in fact, she did not solicit him. He entrapped her. But what he didn't know was she was wired for sound. So when we went to trial, I had that transcript, and Quave was on the stand under oath, and I nailed him to a cross. And he pulled time. I think he served maybe 3 or 3.5 years for perjury. But that was the story on Tony Quave.